So so the extended mind is roughly the thesis that the tools we use can become parts of our mind, especially when they're, coupled to us in the right way, playing roles that are sometimes played internally, but outside the mind. Okay, so here is the case of Inga and Otto that Andy and I put forward back in the 90s. Inga, they're both hanging around New York. Inga's thinking, I want to go to the Museum of Modern Art. Thinks to herself, it's on 53rd Street, and goes there, while Otto is an Alzheimer's patient who records a whole lot of stuff in the notebook that plays many important roles for him. He thinks, I want to go to the Museum of Modern Art, looks it up in his notebook, sees 53rd Street, and goes there. And Andy and I argued that this is these cases are in many respects on a par that, although Otto's process involves something outside the head and Inga's process involves something inside the head, they're both, cognitively equivalent in some respects. And in particular, Otto can be thought of as having the belief or the memory that the Museum of Modern Art is on 53rd Street, even before he looked at the notebook, by virtue of its role in constituting his memory. So that's the core case of the extended mind. Otto's notebook serves as his memory and seems to partly constitute his beliefs, at least his dispositional beliefs, in much the way that Inga's biological memory does. As time has moved along, the cases have gotten a lot more high-tech than the notebook. In particular, there are smartphones have seemed to many people to make extended cognition ubiquitous. Coming augmented reality glasses, maybe even more so. Well, here's an image. These two pictures were both done by Tim Peacock for my book, Reality Plus. Wonderful images. This is Andy Clark walking through a modern city with his augmented reality glasses, which are extending his mind in all kinds of ways. They're helping him recognize people. They're helping with his planning. They're helping with his navigation. Maybe they're even helping store some of his preferences. You can make the case that all of these are in different ways kinds of extended cognition. Functions of the brain are offloaded to the augmented reality glasses, or perhaps to a smartphone. But we'd argue these are still mental or cognitive processes. So the question arises, how much does all this apply to language models? Can large language models such as GPT-3, GPT-4, and their various extensions extend the mind? I mean, some of the issues are very much continuous with the standard extended mind issues, but there are a few that, point in interesting directions. So I thought, okay, it might be nice to at least have an initial think through these issues. What are some of the relevant uses of large language models? Of course, they're used for a tremendous number of things these days already, although a very young technology that already very widely used. One thing that they used, they're not really especially great at, but they're certainly used for is information retrieval. One thing they are really used ubiquitously for is text and code completion. I mean, in programming, they've become absolutely central tool for many programmers already. For people who have to write text, they're often very useful for at least as a kind of writing partner, for producing documents and so on, for generating novel text even. There's a use where, for example, our students use GPT-4 to write papers for their philosophy classes and so on. This is certainly something they're used for. I mean, they're used for, you can use them to try and answer scientific or mathematical problems where they're getting, not perfect, but increasingly better. And indeed, generally, you can use them to advise on courses of action. The other day, somebody spilled some wine on our carpet. So, okay, what do we do to clean up the wine? Well, we asked GPT-4, and it gave some suggestions. It seemed to be okay. Okay, so these are some among many of the uses of these large language models, all of which raise, I think I'll be touching on each of these as, Francois, is everything okay? Is the sound okay?
Good.
You seem, okay. You seem to be, I'm still worried about the sound here, but okay. So yeah, let me start with the case of information retrieval, which is maybe the most quotidian of these. I mean, language model information retrieval is structurally like search engine information retrieval. You know, you look up a fact in a language model, ask it about a fact the same way you can ask Google about a fact, or indeed Otto's notebook. It's, you know, just say Otto were to ask ChatGPT, where is the museum, and it will tell him 53rd Street, and it looks like that address stored in a large language model can constitute Otto's dispositional belief that the museum has a certain location to roughly the extent that his notebook has, with a couple of issues or potential flags to worry about. First, you know, I mean, language model information is notoriously unreliable as things stand. It's not something that, you know, you do your best to rely on in life and death situations. To the extent that information is unreliable and that we know it's unreliable, that tends to undercut trust. And trust it's been noted as a key feature for belief extension. The fact that we trust, Otto trusts the information in his notebook, it doesn't kind of question it, automatically endorses it on seeing it, is a key thing that makes it relevant, that key feature that makes it count as an extension of belief. I think some people have talked about trust and glue as the key features for extension. The fact that we endorse information and the fact that it's always reliably present and available. Insofar as that's not present in current language models, they extend the mind that much less. Another relevant factor is that Andy and I at least played around with the idea that for the core cases of the extended mind, the intuition seemed to go best in cases where the information has at least passed through, let's say, the consciousness of the individual. Let's say Otto, you know, the Otto case works best if he at one point consciously endorsed the, you know, the view that the museum is on 53rd Street and wrote it down himself in the notebook. There, you know, you can certainly raise cases where that's not the case, where other people write things in his notebook for him. But, you know, I think the intuition then is at least somewhat weaker. I mean, it's not exactly an intuitive case, but, you know, this, if you don't have the past endorsement criterion, you get to worries that, you know, does Otto believe everything on the internet? Back in the 90s, they said, does he believe everything in the phone book? I guess there are pretty much no phone books anymore, but does he believe everything on the internet? Someone still got a phone book?
I do.
I've seen them once or twice, just like very local phone books. So yeah, so insofar as previous endorsement is required, you may not find that in a language model. I mean, in some language models, you may, but that may tend to undercut mind extension in these cases. There's also, okay, let's move to a more interesting case, which is, or at least a case that raises somewhat more novel issues, which is text and code completion, where, you know, use language models for writing or for coding authority. You know, you type a bit, and then it kind of completes the code for you. This is used really ubiquitously, as I said, in coding and to some degree with writing. It's kind of analogous, it's kind of like autocomplete on Macs. You know, most people have used autocomplete at least on their phones when texting or writing, and it completes words for you, sometimes automatically, or sometimes if you just give it the okay. You know, I think it's very, very plausible that some forms of external autocompletion count as broadly cognitive. I mean, there are processes analogous to autocompletion that go on unconsciously in the brain, I think, as part of a writing process. You know, you start a sentence and words are suggested to ourselves very naturally as the next word to generate, often thrown up, unconsciously, but you just kind of continue the sentence very, very naturally as words are suggested to one by unconscious processes. But all that unconscious auto-completion then goes on to help constitute mental processes such as uttering or writing down sentences, and indeed sometimes even thinking, insofar as language and thought are very tightly bound. So if internal auto-completion can sometimes constitute mental process, then the parity principle. Well, I didn't put in a slide about the parity principle in the end. The parity principle is the principle Andy and I put forward in the original Extended Mind article that says roughly, if you take a process that would count as cognitive if it were done inside the head, but is actually done outside the head, then it's still cognitive. If the only relevant difference is that one is inside and one is outside, then they should be on a par with respect to cognition. So the parity principle says if autocompletion inside the head is would count as a cognitive process, then the same should apply if it goes on outside the head, if it's at least on a par in relevant ways, which presumably is going to require that, it's especially if it's reliable, if it's trusted, if we just use the results of autocomplete automatically, if it's coupled to us in some reliable way, if it's automatically available, then there's at least a prima facie case for basic autocomplete counting as a very simple cognitive process that constitutes our cognitive process, helps to constitute our cognitive process of writing and thinking. One diagnostic question here is to kind of at least to get at the question is, in these cases, where you use a relevant tool to generate some writing or a program, the question is, well, did I write the program? Did I write the essay? Or did somebody else? Like, in the extreme case, most of us would say when we use autocomplete to write a text message, yes, I wrote the text message. Most of us would say when we get, when a student gets GPT-4 to write its essay, the student did not write the essay. But, there are at least some cases where we've got a very strong, it seems very natural to say that I wrote the program or the essay, that these are in fact my utterances expressing my thoughts and my intentions. So the question is, when and under what conditions is that the case? I think in the case of, completion, text completion, code completion, there's a whole range of cases, what we might call simple autocomplete to extreme autocomplete. Simple autocomplete's analogous to, what you get on your smartphone, mostly making very simple, very standard, very automatic completions from the first few letters in the word, tends to compute to offer the most likely, statistically most likely completions. That seems very much analogous to a process that could go on in the head and would count as cognitive. So I think in these cases, it's very natural to say this is an extended cognitive process. I am writing the text messages or the relevant text or the relevant code through an extended cognitive process. What if we now we make it a bit more fancy? What I call medium autocomplete, which, at least sometimes comes up with a non-standard new word or a new idea. Maybe it's still doing stuff roughly at the sentence level, but it'll occasionally come up with something that's not just statistically the most likely word, but it comes up with a new word or idea that has a modicum of creativity. Here, I think, one judgment may vary a bit depending on how the language model was trained. For example, just say this language model was trained on my own writing. I think Google is getting to the point where soon they're going to train their language models on our own Gmail accounts if we want to, and that will help us a lot in writing emails trained on our own writing. You might well think that in the case where the language model is trained on your own writing and the relevant new ideas somehow derive from your own writing, there's a sense that this is my own extended cognition. This is still my writing at the end of the day. But just say I'm to start writing with that DigiDan model that was trained on Dan Dennett's writing. I don't know. At that point, I feel like, hey, maybe some of the credit goes to Dan or to DigiDan, and it's no longer so clear that this is just me. This language model is introducing new elements that have got not terribly much to do with me. I mean, it's tricky. If it's generate and test, if it comes up with proposals and then I endorse some of them, then maybe that allows me to a somewhat greater extent make them myself. Anyway, we're now though moving towards a spectrum. We're at least moving down a spectrum to which the author of the passage is no longer so clearly just me. So this is one general model for thinking about language models as extending the mind. In the future, I think we're very likely to have personalized language models. We won't all be using the same GPT-4 or whatever. I mean, maybe they'll be fine-tuned, or maybe they'll just be trained on, to a large extent, on our own text and things which are personalized to us. I think there's a reasonable case that personalized language models will be the best mind extenders, and there's the best case that what they produce will still be the products of us. There's also, then we get to extreme auto-completion. Say I asked GPT-4 to auto-complete an essay from the first word. I just give it a word and it produces a whole essay, or I say write an essay on this topic. I think, in that case, it seems extremely implausible to say that I wrote that essay. And look, GPT-4 wrote that essay, for better or for worse. This is not to say that GPT-4 has mental or cognitive capacities on its own. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But GPT-4 wrote the essay, or generated the essay, if you like. I didn't. I mean, our students. Look, I'm sure there are going to be students in my class next semester, next time I teach a big class on this stuff, saying, come on, you just told us that the tools we use can become part of the mind. So I just used GPT-4 to write this paper with me in cooperation with me. And I still wrote that paper just using extended cognition, which you told us is fine. I mean, it's interesting to think about what exactly is wrong with that. But I do think there's a strong sense that at this point, this is wrong. I mean, think about the test that we talked about earlier today, where Dan and DigiDan got a question and Dan wrote one of the answers, but he didn't write the other four. And even if he had been at the helm of the language model generating these responses, he still wouldn't have written those. DigiDan wrote those, those whole paragraphs that had never really passed through Dan's consciousness. I mean, it looks like these were in fact generated by DigiDan. Maybe there's a process you can tell where we make DigiDan and Dan more and more continuous, and Dan is actually has actually been using DigiDan for much of his email and his writing in recent years, and he occasionally generates a paragraph and then endorses it. Maybe there's a version of the story you can tell where it looks more like a mind extension, but at least in these versions of extreme autocompletion, it looks like no. So I mean, interesting question is, why doesn't extreme autocomplete count as extended cognition? You might make the case that at least in some of these cases, if all this happened in my brain, if all this say even the essay generation was happening in my brain, arguably we would count that as my mental processes. So doesn't the parity principle suggest we should count it in external cases too? I think there's a few things going on here, and I certainly haven't gotten remotely to the bottom of what are the key factors here. I mean, one factor is that these external systems just aren't integrated with our cognition in the way that we require of extended cognition. We require systems that are very directly accessible, make all their information available. Perhaps if there were a system which were internal and did all their processing in such a seamless way that they made all the results of the essay writing immediately available to our consciousness, that they're, ready to hand in the Heidegger sense. Heidegger says the hammer counts as more as part of your body when it's always automatically ready to hand. In that case, if it were well enough integrated inside the head, it would count as part of our mind. If it were not well enough integrated inside the head, if it was just, you were just occasionally delivered with a screen inside your head saying, here is your essay, then maybe we wouldn't count that as you're having written the essay either, even if it were internal. So maybe integration, I think, and automaticity is one relevant factor. I mean, more general is the sense that, yeah, in some of these cases, like the language model could be something like a foreign body in the system, not part of yourself. Merely being in your brain isn't enough to make a system part of your own cognition. It has to be integrated in the right way. I mean, there's very much a sense here in which, in the external case at least, it's a different system doing the writing. It's not me. There's another system here present, a language model, perhaps in some cases me plus a language model. That's the system that does the writing. But how can we get to the bottom of that? Here's an analogy. Extended mathematical cognition. Just say I'm given a math problem. Okay, I want to find the answer. So I engage in what you might think is some socially extended cognition. I ask a leading mathematician, say Terry Tao, for the solution. He gives me the solution, then I pass it on. Okay, so I've consulted Terry Tao to find the solution to this mathematical problem. Have I engaged in some extended mathematical cognition, solving the process through an extended, socially extended cognitive process? I think, it's fairly clear in this case, the answer is no. Even though there are cases of socially extended cognition, I think this is not one of them. And the same would be true for consulting Google or on the problem, or consulting a large language model on the problem. Maybe there are versions of this case where it looks a lot more like extended cognition. Maybe if I, upgraded my brain with the latest fancy new mathematics module that, did great mathematical cognition, fairly well integrated with my brain. I just ask it. It's kind of like a simple case would be a calculator. I give it two numbers, it gives me the sum. Did I do it? Did it do it? If it's well enough integrated, you can make the case for seeing it as extended cognition. So, maybe there are versions of this case with good enough integration that start to look more like extended cognition. Likewise, if you had augmented reality, a brain-computer interface that was super well integrated with the rest of your cognition, maybe it would count. Oh yeah, so why doesn't it account? I think one of the central factors is the lack of integration and automaticity. If it's fast, if the answer is fast and automatic enough, then that counts in the favor of extension. But also, it's the fact that it seems that the mathematician is doing all the work here. I hardly did anything. The mathematician did almost everything. So it's kind of a division of labor here. And one worry is that, if another person, or in general in these cases of potential cases of extended cognition, if another person, let's say, does too much of the work, the case starts to look a lot less like my mind being extended and the more like a case of distributed cognition, where I say that two or three of us are collectively solving a problem or cognizing, which is itself, which is a very real phenomenon, happens all the time, but it's somewhat different from extended cognition. Extended cognition is still somewhat Cartesian in that it's centered on a person, and it's their cognition, which is extended with the aids of external devices and sometimes external people, whereas this case is, collective cognition. So maybe a pair of people is thinking and reasoning together. Maybe in some cases, a person plus a language model are collectively thinking and reasoning as partners in thought, in the title of this workshop. And that's, that's an important phenomenon, but distinct from extended cognition. So that kind of raises questions, which I don't really know the answer to, about how to draw the line between extended cognition and distributed cognition. Partly maybe it's the amount of work if too much work gets done in the mind extension, if too much, of the cognition happens there, it starts to look like it's no longer a tool, it's no longer an extension. It becomes perhaps a locus of something like cognition. The degree of integration may matter. And of course, another relevant factor is the extent to which the mind extension may itself count as an agent. To the extent that it's an agent, then you might say, okay, this is two agents doing the work. I mean, it's tricky now because there are cases of socially extended mind. Andy and I talked about this in the 98 paper where, one person, maybe someone's memory is getting bad, and let's say their partner, recognizes people, remembers names, remembers where things are. Claudia, my partner, is always remembers where my keys are better than I do. And in those cases, I think, she's functioning as extended memory system. I think that really is a case of socially extended cognition. But in the clearest cases, I think, the other person is serving kind of a quasi-mechanical function, one that, say, a simple smartphone or a notebook could have played, say, in memory or navigation. You're not using, in that case, where Claudia remembers where my keys are, I'm not really using the full powers of her agency. I don't know whether I'm treating her merely as a means in that case, but which Kant said you shouldn't do. But in any case, the other person is serving a quasi-mechanical function. In cases where they're deploying full agency and full intelligence, it starts to look more like a case of distributed cognition with multiple agents playing an essential role rather than the extended mind, which turns on, one central agent plus extensions. I mean, this kind of connects to some of the things that that Anna and Eric were talking about in their fascinating talk on asymmetric sociality and quasi sociality and so on. This slide I added just after hearing that talk, thinking about, there are different cases, different kinds of social relations I think can play different roles in constituting extended cognition. Like in many cases, we treat another entity as the other, someone we're reacting to, we're responding to, we may or may not be in conflict with, but we treat them as the other. In those cases, I think mind extension is relatively rare. That's a case of interaction between two agents, not extension of one by the other. Extension requires some greater degree of trust or identification, not present in just every standard case of interaction. Then there are cases where multiple beings act collectively. The group of us go to dinner together or solve a problem or write a paper together. In those cases, there it looks like that's distributed cognition or collective cognition, but not extended cognition. It's not like one person's cognition is being extended by the other. I mean, maybe that can be going on, but the core of the phenomenon looks like distributed cognition. You have multiple agents in interaction. So maybe the core social cases are cases when we treat another person, at least for relevant purposes, not so much as a agent, not so much as a collaborator, but somehow, at least for this purpose, when we treat another as a tool or as an assistant. And so maybe those are actually going to be the paradigm cases of extended cognition. To the extent you really rely on another person's agency, it may be less central. This kind of, Anna and Eric's thoughts about asymmetric sociality are relevant here. Maybe some kind of asymmetric sociality actually helps and is central to cases of extended cognition. And to the extent things become really symmetric with multiple agents here, then it starts to turn into something more like collective or distributed cognition. So that, I think, is it's relevant to our relation to language models. I mean, insofar as we treat them, for now, they're tools, they're assistants. So that helps treating them as that helps them qualify, I think, as extended cognition. I mean, there's a thought here. This is all kind of connected to what Eric has called anti-nesting principles in the case of consciousness. The thought is Does the United States count as conscious? Does a car with a driver and a passenger count as conscious? Sometimes there's a thought that if a system has agents inside it in too central a role, that undermines it as counting as conscious, or perhaps as counting as an agent in its own right. Here we're just thinking about a version of this principle that could apply to the extended mind. So, if an external cognitive process essentially involves another agent exercising their agency in an essential way, then it's not extended cognition. It's more like distributed cognition. I mean, maybe we could also have such an anti-nesting role for internal cognitive processes. If there's something too agent-like inside our head, helping us out, then that also is really actually going to be a case of collective cognition involving that agent rather than my own cognition. Of course, that raises deep questions about what counts as an agent, what's the threshold for agency here, not least, and also not least questions about what counts as essentially involving another agent. We've seen there are these cases where a process involves another agent, but maybe just involves them using their memory, some information, so not really essentially involving their agency, but those are notions we'd have to get much clearer and more precise on in order to get clear on all this. There's also the question about what to say in the case of large language model as an advisor for means end reasoning. So, I'd say this already happens with navigation. You want to get to a location, you ask Google Maps. Google Maps tells you how to get there. I want to clean up a carpet spill. A language model might tell me how to clean up the carpet spill. So I want to do X. In order to do that, what should I do? I should do Y. Should we regard in these cases a language model as part of one's own planning or instrumental reasoning system, or is it more of a foreign body? I guess I'm, along the lines of what's gone so far. When it's an automatic process and a fairly simple process, as with, say, Google Maps, then I think it's very reasonable to count it as a extension of cognition. That's just a very natural explanatory structure. To the extent that it's not automatic, involves a whole bunch of separate steps involving you and the system interacting. To the extent it's extremely complex, with the system doing a whole lot of creative work, like here's how you write that paper, and it writes the whole paper for you, then it starts to look like this is better seen as a process that's decomposes into the interaction of an agent and something outside that agent. Of course, there's no bright lines here. Of course, it's on a spectrum, but those seem to be relevant factors in whether this process is best regarded as a single agent process or a multiple agent or an agent plus environment process. Over time, language models and their successors are likely to be better and better integrated into our technology and ultimately into our persons. Smartphones are already better integrated. Mobile computing is already better integrated than desktop computing was, because these phones go with you everywhere. Augmented reality glasses are going to be all the more integrated. You're not even going to have to, lift up your phone to look at them. All kinds of information will just be made available automatically. Brain-computer interfaces, which are coming eventually, are going to be all the more automatic and smooth. You just have to think something, and answers will be delivered. I think as that kind of integration, with that increasing automaticity and ready-to-handness of the information, I take it the mind will become that much more easily extended. So as language models get better integrated with our cognitive system, then I think we'll get increasingly extended minds. Although there's also they may become more and more automatic, but they may also become more and more agent-like. It could happen that language models become more agent-like and less assistant-like. To the degree that they become more agent-like, I'm inclined to think then we'll move more in the direction of distributed cognition, less in the direction of extended cognition. If, on the other hand, we follow Dan's advice and try never to make our language models too agent-like, always make them like tools for cognition, then I think that very much suggests moving in a direction of, seeing language models as tools that extend cognition. There's also, there's so many ethical, there's a million different questions here. What kinds of explanations do these enter into? How does this connect to explanation in cognitive science? How does it connect to many ethical and moral questions about responsibility? But, just say I'm got a language model, which is part of my extended mind, and things go wrong. Who's responsible? Say I'm acting on language model advice, I don't know, in generating writing or in navigating or in deciding, and I produce offensive speech. The car crashes. I make a bad decision based wholly on language models advice, then who's responsible? In general, I think that the extended mind doesn't generally diminish responsibility. So I'm inclined to think at the core of these cases, at least if I accepted and endorsed the extension, then I'm largely responsible for what it produces. There are extreme cases where the maker of a large language model did something that I didn't know about, and they acted irresponsibly. There will be cases where I think the language model's maker will be at least partly responsible for my bad actions. Say they've, the automatic navigation, the automatic driving system in a car just has flaws that they knew about or they should have known about. Then I think they're at least partly responsible for this. I think a relevant comparison here in the non-extended mind case is a case where, say, I perform a bad action after taking a drug. And I think a lot of those cases, I think we want to say that I am responsible, partly because I took on responsibility in taking the drug. Maybe there are cases where it was a medical drug that was very poorly tested and I couldn't have known about these consequences. And we want to say in those cases, at least a very large amount of the responsibility will go to the maker of the drug. But I think, you'll get a continuum of cases in the external cases analogous to the internal cases. Eventually, if we do move in the direction of language models becoming agents, eventually, once a language model is itself a moral agent, it might itself be partly responsible for my own language model guided actions. Then we get into the case of multiple agent cognition, perhaps collective or distributed cognition. We may well be jointly responsible in some cases, as in many cases of joint or collective agents. So, as before, things change as language models move along the spectrum from tools, which I take it is what they are right now, to something more like agents. And we'll move away from extended cognition to something more like distributed cognition. Okay, that's just about all. I just thought that before finishing, I think it's more or less obligatory. I thought it was more or less obligatory for a talk like this to actually ask a language model what it thinks about these questions. So I asked GPT-4, can a large language model be part of a human being's extended mind in the Clark and Chalmers sense? What are the best reasons for and against? And it gave me some answers. After a brief preamble, let's consider whether it could be part of a human being's extended mind. Reasons for cognitive offloading. Individuals are offloading cognitive tasks onto the model. Deep integration. If a user integrates with us, interacts regularly, relies on it enough, we consider deeply integrated into their cognitive routines. Trust and corrective mechanisms. If the user trusts the model, then that makes it count more, even more so if there are corrective mechanisms in place, like the model learning from user feedback, and you get even better integration. Okay, so pretty good answers, pretty good reasons in favor. Reasons against: lack of bidirectional input. The model doesn't learn from the individual in the ways that human cognitive systems do. You might think that counts against. Lack of autonomy. The language model doesn't have its own belief, desires, or consciousness. Responses are statistical predictions. I'm not sure that really counts against being part of the extended mind. You might even think it counts in favor given what I've said. Dependence on infrastructure that might, the power might go down, the internet might go down, which makes it fragile and unreliable. It's at least relevant. There are privacy and security considerations. Okay, those look more like ethical considerations. Okay, so when I assess its answer, I say, okay, well, it looks like offloading, integration, and trust. Those are all pretty relevant reasons in favor of large language model mind extension. I don't know about the reasons against. Lack of autonomy and privacy seem like pretty weak reasons against the possibility of this. Two-way interaction, unreliability is somewhat stronger. I don't know two-way interaction is required. So if you ask me, overall reasons for language model extension are looking here somewhat stronger than reasons against. And at least this interaction with GPT-4 was somewhat useful in coming to this conclusion and assessing. I didn't actually write the whole talk by feeding all this to GPT-4 first and running it that way. I could have, but at least it's an interesting check, which actually just raises an interesting concluding question: is this process of consulting with GPT-4 on this philosophical matter itself a case of extended cognition? I mean, you might say it's contributing the ideas, but hey, I suspect it stole a couple of those ideas from Andy and me. So maybe there's one of those loops in there that might make it all the more like extended cognition. Anyway, interesting case to think about. Thanks very much.